Right. Hi, my name is Barzey. I'm a consultant. I've been consulting in the pharmaceutical industry for over 10 years. I've consulted at GSK, Johnson & Johnson, Celgene, Sanofi Aventis, Novartis, the list is endless, doing regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance, and global medical affairs. So I bring that knowledge to various conferences and give key examples of different experiences I've had in the different situations I've had to work through along my career. So today, I'm going to present on reviewing the country-specific labelling requirements and degree of dependency on foreign labels in the Middle East and North Africa region. So, if you can imagine, for myself, most of the time I work in a global team. You can imagine there's lots of different markets all over the world, and when you're sitting in a global team, trying to have oversight of the whole world is very complicated. MENA is a small section, but it's a growing market. There's lots of untapped potential and growth for the pharmaceutical industry. And if you want to have a multinational company, you need to make sure that you spread your product knowledge and invest into multiple markets, because it also reduces the risk of your company going down from changes in regulations in one particular market. So, for example, if the US changed some regulations or put pricing restrictions in, and you had your products there and in MENA, it increases the strength of your company. I do have this list in here because I wasn't aware of how much you would have discussed MENA beforehand, and I am aware I am the last presentation of this 3-day summit, so I'll skip this one. And here's some quick facts. From my experience of dealing with vendors in various markets, it's often considered that Jordan is a generic hub. I don't know if that's a fact, but that's how I have been informed by in various global departments that if we're a generic company, Jordan is a good place to start with your generic markets. Now, here's market entry problems. Western approval. As I will discuss further later on, there are some markets in the MENA region which require you to have a period of Western approval, which would mean the US, EMA, or so on. Some markets will give you an accelerated approval procedure if you do have, let's say, a centralized EU SPC. And I'll discuss this later on. For example, Israel and Europe have a mutual recognition of their GMP procedures. So if you have your product licensed in Europe, Israel will accept the GMP procedures, and Europe will also accept Israel's GMP procedures because they agree to abide by the same regulations when it comes down to good manufacturing processes. So that's one thing that you need to think of early on, is your target products in your development plan. What type of guidelines are you going to really focus on, and what market you're going to do first? CPP, GMPs, price approval. Price approval varies from different country to country in MENA, just like it varies in the rest of the world. For example, the US doesn't have a cap, EU has quality assessments, and so on. And harmonisation. I personally don't feel there's much harmonisation across the MENA region, but it is better than when I first started the industry last decade. Here's a bit of information about CPP. I don't know if anybody's explained this to you already, but I'll go to do it anyway. The World Health Organization's primary devised CPPs as a way to enable regulatory authorities to ascertain the good manufacturing process and quality status of the product which has been submitted for approval. It's worth noting that, for example, if you're going to use a CPP from the States, the FDA have strict guidelines, and before they issue a CPP, you have to prove that you're going to import it out of the US. So if you have it solely marketed in the US, you'll need to provide documentation on imports and exports in relation to the US. A CPP also helps to establish that a drug product in the approval market is the same quality as that of the approval product which is being imported. Here's some regulatory challenges for the MENA market. So, harmonisation of regulatory requirements is poor across the region. Regulations change or are introduced sometimes without warning. I do recall once when I was consulting for a consumer healthcare company. They had acquired some products from acquisition of another consumer healthcare company. So we were updoing the packaging of a particular brand globally. We submitted the pack with Hebrew and Arabic and English, and we had a letter back from the Israeli government telling us to add Russian. Still to this day, I do not know why we had to submit a Russian version. And before doing this presentation, I tried to understand why 3 years ago we had to submit a Russian version, but that was the request that came out of the blue. And if anybody is aware of why 3 years ago I had to submit a Russian consumer healthcare text, please enlighten me. Some regulations found in the European Union and USA are absent. For example, in Europe and the US, Australia as well, you have regulations on orphan drug designation. So those are for drugs which are to treat diseases which occur in Europe in less than 5 in 10,000 patients. So it's rare disease. Now, in Europe and the US, you can get your product marketed on phase 2 trials. So you can get it launched on phase 2 trials because they understand that with rare disease, it's very hard to get the numbers you need for phase 3. However, in the MENA region, I am yet to see some solid regulations on orphan drug designation. The way that the company that I consulted for doing oncology, the way they did it was by going on the basis of the safety and efficacy had been proven through acceptance by the EMA, the TGA, and the FDA. So they basically submitted their approval history in those markets as justification for using phase 2 data. Some of the regulatory authorities have limited resources. Working in the US, which I do at this point in time, and in Europe, it's easy to forget that some of these markets you have one person doing sales, marketing, PV, regulatory, medical affairs. This needs to be taken into account when you are planning. You need to give them, from a global perspective, if you have your company core data sheet and you know that that's going to trickle down to them, do try to include them in your best draft documents or soon as it has been approved at a global level in the boardroom. Also try to make sure that they are notified when an EUSPC or a USPI has been updated. This does help them because they get to plan their variations in their workload and so on. This is not even just for the MENA, it also applies for European countries because in some markets in Europe there is just one person covering multiple markets. And I know with one company there was one person doing the whole of MENA in medical, PV and regulatory. I do not envy that person. Global Labelling Board, which I just mentioned, is from a global perspective, is a group of people who will discuss the company's position on a particular product, how this applies to MENA. In large multinationals, I've had experience where they would have the regional regulatory representative, more MENA, would be invited to listen in, would be invited to have the minutes, that way to inform them to get their affairs in order for a submission or an update or a new product, rather than them just getting a finalised request of this, can you submit this to your health authority, to include the regulatory or safety or medical affairs individual in the global discussions to make sure that they don't feel that they're just getting orders from top level. I have had companies where I've consulted at a company which there was not a good flow of communication between the MENA market and head office, where decisions were made, and after the decisions were made, that's when they would inform whether it's their vendor or their local regional contact of the changes. Here's a diagram of how where MENA would sit, which is like within regional regulatory affairs. So you've got your global team, and in an aspect of MENA, because of Because when you're in a multinational market, it's very hard for you to have oversight of every single regulation for every single country, especially with MENA, because there's varying opinions, varying and changing regulations. So you would have someone in the region, in MENA, whether it's to cover the multiple markets in MENA or to cover the whole of Africa and someone to cover the whole of the Middle East. And that person would be responsible for confirming with the global team over here that they will be able to submit the new product or the update to an existing product straight away or delayed because they rely on, let's say, an EU SPC. They need the CPP to be submitted to them. They need the US package insert as well as the US package insert. So that's the communication there from the regional contacts to global, because you would expect them to have the expertise to understand what their local market requirements are and stay abreast and updated with it. So this is a very fluid process. The communication will change. The yes, no, delayed or maybe will change. Okay. Strategies for success. Proper time management is key, as the registration and company success depends on the time taken to be the first in the market. And as I've said, you should know or have a relationship with someone who does know and can be compliant with national requirements. Some people use clinical research organizations. There are various vendors in Jordan where you can set up a contract from a multinational company, stipulating the contract that they will communicate to you within changes of particular markets. They will ensure that they receive the Jordanian health authorities' questions and ensure that they are translated and submitted to you within a set period of time. Those type of contracts are reviewed during inspections, and this is how you, if you're not actually in the MENA market per se, this is how you can ensure compliance and consistency from your company position with what's actually going on in the MENA markets. Relationships with the health authorities are critical. Previous speakers have discussed having a good flow of communication. This again goes back to hopefully having a good contact in the region. You need to be able to know how to communicate to them. Some do accept electronic communication. Some you have to post printed documents. Try to communicate early with the health authorities, not late. Try to maintain communication. Consider the emerging market strategy during development plans and consult and consider regional requirements for the global regulatory plan. This is when you have your discussions and your plans, you need to be aware of waves. Now, waves is a term which some companies use and some don't. When you are trying to manage the markets which are reliant on other markets. So, for example, Morocco, for one particular product I was responsible for globally, Morocco was linked to the French SPC. Why? Because when they originally launched the product in Morocco, they used the French SPC as validation that the safety and efficacy passes their requirements. So every time the French SPC was being updated, you would have to then submit it to Morocco. So you need to consider which markets you're going to submit to first. There are some markets which will allow, I'm going to discuss later on, there are some markets that will allow you to submit your clinical package and your full package without it being approved in other markets. I've spoken about Jordan. I'm going to go over some examples of my own personal experiences with dealing with certain countries. So the Jordan Food and Drug Administration has strict requirements on the registration of new products. They do take into consideration registration status by well-recognized health authorities. So you can submit straight to Jordan first off. However, that would rely on you having a particular vendor there who had a good relationship with the Jordanian FDA, and the approval process on experience would be longer than if you submitted the product to the US and Europe first off, and then submitted it to Jordan afterwards. The experience I've had of having an oncology product approved in Jordan, it was a quick turnaround time because we had the evidence that it had been accepted by the EMA and had been accepted by the US. Even though there were discrepancies between the indication between the two countries. For example, Europe wanted you to, for the treatment of a particular cancer, you needed to have 2 additional products in combination with the new product. Whereas in the US, they didn't mind if you just took it as a standalone treatment. So we submitted those products, we submitted that information to Jordan, and then we submitted a separate document explaining this is our position. We understand where the EMA came from with their combination treatment. However, that's not how we feel as a company. Jordan decided to adopt the FDA's position and therefore were linked to the USPI from then on. Registration of a drug requires the drug to be marketed at least for 1 year in its country or origin in the JFDA reference country. So that comes into account when you're doing your waves of new product submission. On paper, the approval process for a new product takes approximately 12 months. I say on paper because, as with all markets, Jordan is not any different. When you do get questions, if you take time doing your questions and getting it translated, going back to, let's say, head office in London, getting it translated back to Jordan, you can get delays. Some products have taken more than 12 months, some have taken less than 12 months. And as I've just stated, a fast-track application may be requested for vital and highly required medicines, making 6 months. And that can be further supported with registered product information from standalone major markets. Lebanon. Pharmaceutical company must be registered with the Ministry of Public Health. When I worked for one particular company who acquired another one, the company they acquired wasn't registered with Lebanon. They thought that because they acquired a company that was registered in Lebanon, they could follow on suit. No, they had to re-register their company in Lebanon, even though they had acquired it, and that delayed the variation of a safety change because they had to then apply to be registered as a company, provide all this type of information, and then submit the safety variation. Approvals can take between 8 and 12 months. And the drug must have been proven safe and effective through clinical trials and preferably approved by the FDA and or EMA. Egypt. The new drug application is viewed by multiple committees, and the approval process can take up to 5 years. The variation for Egypt, which included a new indication, took 3 years and 6 months, which I had experience of. But I have been told by former colleagues that it has taken up to 5 years. And when I have done my research just to check if this is still the current situation, it has been stated up to 5 years. The application consists of drugs legalized pharmaceutical product certificates, clinical data, and international registration status with price. In addition, 20 drug samples must undergo analysis. However, the bioavailability testing can be waived if you have FDA or EMA approval. Algeria. New drug applications must be sent to the Algerian Ministry of Health, which must include all drug information, such as administration, pharmacological products, pharmacodynamics, the molecular structure. For example, you don't have to do the molecular structure in Europe, but you do in US. 2 drug samples, unlike Egypt, where it's 20, including the final drug sample and the raw materials used, sent to the pharmaceutical products Control National Laboratory, along with the drug's dosage information. Revision of the drug record file generally takes about 3 months or more, after which the Ministry of Health grants a 1-year provisional registration. The 5-year registration comes at the end of all the tests. Saudi Arabia. New drug applications are submitted to the drug sector, which, as you have been informed, has been moved to Dubai from Abu Dhabi. The Saudi Food and Drug Administration, which assures accuracy of all information submitted, compliance with requirements and guidelines, and an assessment of drug quality and efficacy. Recommendation for approval or rejection is forwarded to the Director of Product Licensing Department within 4 months. Samples are tested by laboratory and inspection units at the Ministry of Health within another 4 months. Finally, all reports are forwarded to a registration committee that issues approval, usually within an additional month. From start to finish, the entire process can take about 18 months. In particular with Saudi Arabia, I have noticed from receiving requests for further information from them that they do, on a periodic basis, read the registered product information of other markets. So there was a product that I was responsible for 4 years ago, which was for urology. And we received a letter from, the vendor in Saudi Arabia received a letter which was then translated and sent to head office, which requested a warning to do with blood donation. At the time, we didn't know where they had requested this information to be included into the Saudi label. And then it came to conclusion that they were reading the USPI. The FDA had requested for that statement to be in there, even though the Saudi originally took, when the product was licensed, they took the UK SPC, but at the time they were periodically reviewing USPIs, the EU, the UK MHRA SPC, and the Australian registered product information, and then doing an analysis on the differences between their label and then sending companies a request for that information to be included. We subsequently sent a letter to them saying that we do not feel that this is viable for patients. We do not feel it's relevant because the amount of concentration in the bloodstream is this and so on, so this. However, they rejected that and they mandated that we had to include the FDA wording in there. They never mentioned FDA, US FDA. They never told us where they got the information from. They just sent 2 letters, one saying include this text, and then the other one was no, we do not accept the data package you've sent us. We want you to include this warning and precaution. Which was another evidence of them changing the way that they work without informing us, because we didn't know that they would be reviewing registered product information outside what they had told us was their reference, and their reference was the UK SPC. So we thought if it was in line with the UK SPC, we wouldn't get any questions. They changed their mind. Bahrain, the average time for approval for new drugs is 3 to 6 months. However, in order to authorize local marketing of a drug, it has to have been marketed in another country for a minimum of 2 years to ensure sufficient pharmacological efficacy and safety. Additionally, prior to importing a drug, it should be first licensed in one of the GCC countries like Saudi Arabia. Oman, as with Bahrain, in order to authorize local marketing of a drug, it has to have been marketed in another country for a minimum of 2 years to ensure efficacy and safety. Registration of a pharmaceutical product approximately takes 6 to 12 months. If a drug is not imported within 1 year of approval, it may be deregistered and the registration procedure must be repeated. I did work for a company where this actually happened, where they registered in multiple, they sent registration out, but they didn't actually import and didn't actually market it out. They just thought that they could register it, and then when they found that they actually wanted to start marketing, they were told by the health authority that they need to start the registration process again and pay the fee again. Renewal of registration is required every 5 years. And this is my last slide. Israel. Applicants submit to the pharmacological department within the Ministry of Health. The pharmacology department conducts assessment on safety, efficacy, and quality. The Ministry of Health subsequently provides approval and registers the drug. So you have two different teams. The only way I can compare it is when you have the EMA and the CHMP, where you have one particular department that does the scientific review and analysis, and you have another one who actually does the approval. And when the pharmacology departments give you an opinion saying that we agree with you and so on, that does not mean it's approved. It's only approved when the Ministry of Health actually approve it, and then you have to wait for it to be forwarded on. Additionally, as I said earlier, Israel has an agreement on conformity assessment and acceptance of industrial products with the EU. This agreement means that Israel and the EU recognise each other from a GMP perspective. GMP inspection conclusions in Israel are accepted by the EMA and vice versa. Manufacturing and import authorizations are also accepted vice versa. Certification and conformity of batches. So if you have a certification in Europe, it means you don't need to retest for the Israeli market. And if you get certification in Israel, you don't need to get retesting for an import of Europe. And officially quality controlled batch releases is also recognised. Thank you for listening. Any questions? No questions? Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. This was our last presentation. There will be a few break for the drinks, and then